Module 3 is based on Chapter 3 in the book and is titled Germany and the Birth of a New Science. The people we're going to talk about in this chapter were the first to really look at the connection between the mind, the body, and science. We look at this physiologically as well as philosophically, and that's kind of how Wundt got started in it. So we're going to take a look at that. First, though, we have to talk about the schools that were in Germany. We'll briefly touch on those. What I want to talk mostly about, though, is the idea of Wissenschaft. That's the idea that you have a looser type of curriculum going on rather than having a structured, this is how you want to do it type thing. The Wissenschaft idea went a long way to developing a freedom of curriculum, whereas the students were kind of allowed to do whatever they wanted to within reason to develop their own curriculum. And the professors were able to teach much more freely and to be a little more exploratory, do a little more research, and to engage the students in research as well. It was kind of like an all okay to go ahead and study and teach whatever you wanted to as a way to develop, as a way to be progressive. With that idea in mind, we talk about Wilhelm Wundt again. How nice. We got a podcast from him, I think it was Module 1, and now we're going to talk about him again, and that's okay. He's a decent guy to spend some time on. He went a long ways. Not everybody agreed with him. He's kind of like the Freud of the first laboratory, where he developed it and he did a pretty good job of it. He did it substantially. But there are people who came along and tweaked his stuff and didn't like how he did it and all that kind of nonsense. There's a lot of ego that goes along with developing something for the very first time, especially if you have something as structured as Wundt and you don't want somebody coming in and just going ahead and doing whatever they want to it. Um, he actually went to a university in Germany, Heidelberg, and he graduated at the top of his class. Yay! Well, that's because he's a really smart guy and he really wanted to get into this stuff. And it's noted that he was a medical scholar, which is different than what you would think from a guy like that. But you got to remember, too, is that there was no psychology going on, that just wasn't available. Because there was no psychology, he really didn't have a way to look into all of this while he was in school. Well, that's kind of the reason why he developed his own laboratory, to kind of take a look at the balance between physiology, what was going on with the body, which he practiced and looked at from a medical point of view, with the other stuff that was going on, like mind and feelings and perception and sensation and all that other fun stuff that nobody really could take a look at because it wasn't something that you could see on the person. It was inside the brain, which was something that they had not been able to look at. This was really a new domain of science. Wundt opened up his first laboratory for studying just about however he wanted to. We read a lot about the unethical practices that had gone on, and they probably still went on with him too, but we don't see a lot of it, mostly because he did a lot of practicing on himself and training his students to do it too. So it's really difficult to see anywhere that he was terribly unethical as far as what it says in the book, but one could assume, maybe unfairly, that there was something unethical going on based on today's standards. Nevertheless, he combined his curiosity of philosophy, which is more or less an unempirical, not even a science, it's not really a science, it's more of a theoretical practice, but he wanted to combine what people were thinking about philosophically, kind of abstractly, with the empiricism of psychology. Physiology. He wanted to be able to put numbers onto what was going on inside the mind that we couldn't see. He was fairly driven by this, which led to him writing about 53,753 pages in his lifetime. The book breaks it down, and it was something crazy like 2 published pages per day every day for 68 years. He really recognized how important the process of publication was. He had to get this stuff out there and written. Wundt had a couple different views in psychology. One was voluntarism, and the other was cultural, which is kind of what the dubbed name for Volcker psychology is. It's important to know that the term Volcker didn't really translate so hot, but it's been generally agreed upon that cultural is going to be what that translates best to. The idea of voluntarism was an experimental approach. You see the word volunteer in there, kind of, and it's really talking about the idea that you have people who are willing to help you and who are doing an experiment with you under direction, and in his case, he was doing it too. The cultural aspect of it, which we'll talk about a little later, are the other ideas and theories that Wundt postulates cannot be observed through experimentation. So he'll submit, too, that there are some things in the philosophical realm that you cannot look at empirically. Wundt had a couple goals of psychology. According to Wundt, the goal of psychology was to discover the facts of consciousness. Very interesting idea to think of what that really means by how you look at it today. But he defined consciousness as all that we are aware of. That's something that I paraphrase, but I think it still captures the essence. The idea is that anything that you think about, look at, do, feel is part of consciousness as far as he's concerned. He also believed that this consciousness was comprised of the content and the observer's interpretation of the content, which kind of leads into perception, what you see and how you interpret what you see. I use see rather vaguely. I guess what I mean by see is not necessarily just sight, but things that you observe. And I guess that could mean hearing, feeling, tasting, touching, seeing, hearing, all that stuff. To him, this was the key difference between science and psychology. He also had a really good idea about the idea of using scientific instrumentation and theory as a way to experience the world. Objectivity and empirical evidence was something that he really relied on, and he felt that the best way to do that was to use some kind of scientific instrumentation. If not, then you have a lot of human error, and he wasn't necessarily a big fan of that. He wanted things to be fairly concise, replicable, and something that he could say was very firm in the way the experiment was carried out. However, he also insisted that the experience is comprised of the different interactions between sensation, affect, and perception. Thus, psychology would indicate a subjective perception of any stimulus. So it's interesting, he wants to use the scientific instrumentation, but at the same time, he also admits that there are some things that we see subjectively. It's kind of like that old philosophical question, how do I know that what I see as red is the same thing you see when you see red? That's all subjective and is open for interpretation. He came up with the term apperception as a way to willfully interpret stimulus. He felt that you have apperception if you are able to focus on something and draw your attention to it. Apperception allows us to focus on a certain stimulus and simultaneously block out other occurrences. It is an ability for us to concentrate on something intentionally, and is completely voluntary. He had a fairly decent grasp on early research techniques as well. He kind of looked at the scientific method. He looked at a way to eliminate too many extraneous variables, how to get around confounding information, and he did that by using students as trained observers. He would train them to be ready to look for a particular stimulus. He would show them what the stimulus looked like, and then he would tell them how to respond, and that way he could easily, well, to him, easily take a look at things like reaction time, which he really spent a lot of time on. This was important to him to be able to eliminate things like trying to think on the fly. So that's why he trained his students to be able to know what to look for and eliminate the need for them to think about it too much. He wanted to do what the pure reaction was, not necessarily trying to interpret what the task was supposed to be. He used trials as well. The problem with the trials that he did use was that usually the sample size was small. That should be a Z. The sample sizes were usually small, like one trial for each person, for example. What he also did was adjusted variables in order to test differences in perception. For example, he might do something like, I want you to push a button when you see the light come on. And then he would say to somebody else, I want you to push the button that corresponds with red if it's a red light, or the button that corresponds with blue if it's a blue light. He would do things like that to see if there was a difference in processing time between whether you could press a button just to see if a light came on versus pushing a button to see if you can differentiate between a blue and red light. Not too bad. We still do that kind of stuff now. Looks like I got a little ahead of myself. Still on the early research techniques. He tested reaction time, and it even is used quite frequently today. Uh, and then there was another theory, was that if neurotransmission were involved, then timing certain mental process was possible. If we had a rough idea of how long it took for neural impulses to work, then we could kind of do a subtraction formula by subtracting reaction time and motor response, and that would equal the mental processing time. So if we could figure out how long it generally took people to react to something, and how long it took for them to physically respond to that same stimulus, then you'd be left with the mental processing. And that was quite interesting to them because it had been something that nobody had really looked at before. And again, I got a little ahead of myself talking about the idea of having color-coded keys and responding in different certain situations. But it's important to know that despite all the training and all the observing that they did with the students trying to learn what the test was supposed to do and know what to look for, they were still highly unstable because of the lack of standardization and precision. Today we can do this much more easily because of computers. Um, a basic computer program like PowerPoint, for example, can be used for designing experiments, which I actually did in my undergrad work. What you can do, for example, in this case, was push a button and another button would pop up and you'd have to push a computer key to say whether it was a blue button or a red button that popped up, and PowerPoint would actually time that for you, and then you could tabulate all the data and figure out what the mean of all of the scores were and come up with some kind of meaningful statistic. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Things as simple as that are still very important in scientific or psychological research. Again, is that concept of Volcker psychology. Wundt speculated that there was a whole area of knowledge that could not be looked at experimentally. He just calls it a higher mental process that would take a different era of learning to be able to take a look at. Not much is said in here about that for the fact that it focuses mostly on the tangible aspects of his work, but it's still worth mentioning that Wundt had a good idea that there was something else out there that was really difficult for them to explain. Hermann Ebbinghaus and memory. Ebbinghaus was one of those guys that's hit and miss for people in undergrad psych courses or even high school psych courses. Ebbinghaus experiments are very easy to replicate, they're fairly consistent, and they're kind of fun to do. He worked primarily by himself, though. Didn't have the big following that Wundt had, except for the fact that he really didn't want to work with others. There are stories about him being more or less a shut-in, but it's neither here nor there. He did catch a lot of grief for trying to study memory and learning because others' thoughts was that there was just too much subjectivity and there are limited amounts of control on the type of things that he was talking about. Mostly because they talked about what really is an early predecessor to schemas and things of the like, that you have words and they mean something and they get stored differently, and Ebbinghaus was concerned mostly with just pure learning. He didn't want to know how you stored it, he just wanted to know how long it took you to store something. So he came up with a few different ways to get around that. However, he first started studying on himself, which kind of sounds strange, but we'll get to that in a second. He wanted to test his memory in a variety of situations. He realized the issues of creating his own test. Well, yeah, if you create your own test, you know what the answers are, you know what's on the test, blah, blah, blah. If he knew the test ahead of time, he would not be learning in a pure sense. He would be really learning, he would be creating a test, trying to forget it, and then learning it again, but not really because you already knew it, and he knew that was going to happen. As a matter of fact, that's kind of what his studying was about, was the idea of relearning something. Well, one aspect of it anyways. So what he did was he used nonsense syllables, all of the same length and structure, to create a list of learnable words. For example, a nonsense syllable would be something like H-I-J. Okay, so it sounds like Hidge maybe, or something like Q-E-D, Ked or Qued or whatever you could say. But the point of them was that they weren't known, they didn't have any kind of background familiarity, and they needed to be learned. It was difficult to learn them because they didn't follow any real grammar, sentence structure, spelling, anything. It was just nonsense. Okay, and we even use those same nonsense syllables today. It's kind of like the Rorschach. We use the Rorschach today, and we actually use the exact same pictures as were used back at the turn of the century. Same thing with the thematic apperception test, sometimes referred to as the TAP. We use the exact same pictures as were used back when it was first developed, and we do it for good reason because it gives us a really good sample to go by, and if we're using the same types of tests, then we can standardize it. Unfortunately, that's all for Ebbinghaus for now. Franz Brentano developed something called act psychology. He focused on the acts associated with sensation. He believed that we must be searching for consciousness, kind of playing off of Wundt's idea. The purpose of our sensations are to absorb information in order to process it. So he figured that if that's what we are trying to do, is to absorb information and process it into consciousness, then we must be actively using our sensation to look for consciousness. He believed that there is a more fundamental issue between perception and sensation. Perhaps we see what we want to see. That's kind of a big issue in therapy, is that sometimes we are looking for something or are not looking for something, and we choose to see it or we choose not to see it. Brentano also believed in a term called experimentum crucis, and that is actually how it was said in Latin. Darn it, it's not a soft C. There are no soft C's in Latin. Brentano believed that one should develop a set of large experiments to test the more important problems with smaller experiments to figure out the lesser details. He also wanted to look at introspection as a way to seeing how your own consciousness might be getting in the way. He wanted to take away that experimenter subjectivity, which is actually the basis for a lot of good experiments now, which is why we use computers a lot. We want to take away our role in affecting the experiment. Conversely, we also have to be introspective as therapists in order to do good work with your clients, or else you could get in the way of their progress. So he was a really pioneer in looking at how you need to look at yourself in order to make sure that you're not screwing something up. The book didn't do a great job of paying tribute to Carl Stumpf, but he came up with the psychology of tone. He was a musician, and there are Greek predecessors to Carl Stumpf, and I'll give anybody extra credit if they can look up a predecessor to Carl Stumpf in terms of looking at how music and the mind go together. That's a good test to make sure you're listening to these podcasts as well. He disagreed with Wundt on what would be considered a good observer, however. Wundt thought that if you had somebody who was trained to know what to look for, however, at the same time, did not have any kind of expertise in what was going on, that made a great observer. In other words, we want somebody who has a clue of what's going on, but not somebody who's a professional at it. For example, if you were training somebody to hit a baseball left and right-handed and to see which they were better at, you wouldn't want a professional baseball player who was a switch hitter to be your observer, or in this case, your subject. Stump thought, or back to reality, Stump thought trained listeners would be best and Wundt thought they would be biased. It's still hard to tell, but we don't know which is good. But my best inclination is that it's good to have trained people in some circumstances and untrained in the other circumstances. It may not have been a bad idea to have trained musicians in the psychology of tone as far as developing the theories and developing the experiments, but it may have been a good thing to have untrained observers or untrained experimental subjects. Mueller was along the same lines of Ebbinghaus and wanting to take a look at memory. He studied things like sensation, color vision, learning, attention, and psychophysics, but he focused mostly on memory. And Mueller's contribution to it was that he was a post hoc experimenter where he asked subjects what strategies they were using to memorize lists. He didn't tell them what strategies to use. He didn't give them any direction. He said, memorize this and let me know how it goes. So what he did was he just kind of let them go. And after they did all the work, he went back and sampled them and saw what was going on. And that was a way for him to do research. It's actually a valid way to do research. He may have caught a little bit of gruff for not developing his experiments very well, but in reality, they worked just fine. Another thing he liked to do was to look at interference as opposed to forgetting over time. He wanted to find the things that interfered with learning and decide whether these things happened retroactively or proactively or at the same time as. He wanted to find out what caused people not to learn at the same rate. And last but not least is Kolpe. He did thinking. His name was Oswald Kolpe. He was around the same time as Wundt and actually took courses from Wundt. How about that? He used retrospection again, kind of an after-the-fact method. But what I like about what he did was he came up with something called a mental set. He came up with that's a concept that incorporates an instruction into a task as to preclude that task from taking additional processing. The example that the book gives, which is a fine example, was he told the subjects to add two numbers together once the subject saw the numbers. And what he found after the fact, using his retrospection, was that when the subjects saw the numbers, they didn't have to think consciously, I need to add these two numbers up. They saw the two numbers, added them together without any further processing, and got some kind of response. So what he liked to do was talk about the fact that you can program people to be learners and to be able to actually do something rather subconsciously and that way more quickly as a way of teaching them to learn better. That is it for this chapter. This is your first time hearing my voice for some of you. So get cracking on the discussion boards, get cracking on the exam from last week, and be prepared for an exam for next week on this material. Bye-bye.